It's time for the Democratic Party to make universal basic income part of the Democratic Party platform. I'll explain more later in the lecture concerning why the Democrats should do this. Republicans. Republican President Richard Nixon was considering a universal basic income program, and he was advised against it. And just think about where the United States would be today economically if the Nixon administration would have implemented a universal basic income program. Remember, Republican President George W. Bush used trickle-down economics, which led to a housing market bubble that burst and people were foreclosed on and put out of their homes, while corporations received bailouts paid for by the poor and middle class. When President George W. Bush should have used trickle-up economics and instituted a universal basic income program that would have met the same home ownership objective without a housing market bubble. Just because a United States federal universal basic income program has never been done does not mean that it should not be done. And for Republicans and right-wingers who constantly talk about socialism coming to the United States, socialism has existed for generations in the United States on the government side of the United States hybrid economic system. And regulated capitalism has existed for generations on the private side of the United States hybrid economic system. The United States hybrid economic system is made up of two parts, which are the government side and the private side. And for irrefutable proof concerning the United States hybrid economic system, visit us online at www.byronmichelgoins.com and listen to our lectures entitled The Truth About Socialism and The Truth About Capitalism and the United States Socialism and Regulated Capitalism. Democrats, remember the words of President Lyndon B. Johnson concerning ending poverty in the United States. According to a 2014 House Budget Committee report at republicans-budget.house.gov entitled The War on Poverty 50 Years Later, President Lyndon B. Johnson stated the following words in his 1964 book entitled My Hope for America, and I quote, "We have declared unconditional war on poverty. Our objective is total victory. I believe that 30 years from now, Americans will look back upon these 1960s as the time of the great American breakthrough toward the victory of prosperity over poverty." End of quote. President Johnson stated, "We have declared unconditional war on poverty." Merriam-Webster's online dictionary defines unconditional as not conditional or limited. In other words, the war on poverty is not subject to any conditions. President Johnson knew that the war on poverty would need many great ideas and legislative efforts to bring the desired results. According to the House Budget Committee website at republicans-budget.house.gov, President Lyndon B. Johnson stated the following words in his 1964 State of the Union address, and I quote, "Our aim is not only to relieve the symptom of poverty, but to cure it, and above all, to prevent it. No single piece of legislation, however, is going to suffice." End of quote. President Johnson's statement in and of itself proved that the war on poverty was going to be one in which other pieces of legislation would be necessary to relieve, cure, and prevent poverty. And Democrats, now is the time to take the opportunity to relieve, cure, and prevent poverty in the United States. Don't be afraid to initiate $2,000 in monthly United States federal government guaranteed universal basic income for all poor and middle-class United States citizens at least 18 years of age, funded through the Federal Reserve System. And contrary to popular belief, there are undoubtedly Republicans and right-wingers who are struggling financially along with their families. And some of them are homeless. And they privately support the idea of universal basic income, although they won't say it publicly because they walked the Republican ideological line concerning universal basic income. There is no doubt that if Democrats initiate universal basic income, they will pick up Republican voters who cross the line and vote Democrat because they want to continue getting universal basic income if it has already been made law, or they'll want to get it if it is being promoted by Democrats to make it law. Democrats control both houses of Congress and the office of the president. And as I stated earlier, it's time for the Democratic Party to make universal basic income part of the Democratic Party platform. Democrats, do this and you will make history. And the United States will be an example to the world on how to end poverty and end national debt. There are future elections coming, and if poor and middle class people want a government that focuses on the poor and middle class instead of the rich, voting for Republican candidates is not the way to go. It is clear that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are the two main political parties in the United States. But Republican actions when in leadership has favored the rich over the poor and middle class, even when Republicans stated they were attempting to help the poor and middle class. Remember President George W. Bush, minority home ownership, the housing market bubble that burst, and the corporate bailouts for corporations, while people throughout the United States were foreclosed on and put out of their homes? Remember that? The people, through voting against all Republican candidates and voting for their choice of the other candidates, can force the Republican Party to return to its historical roots as a party for the least of these, if it is wise. And it's going to take the people to bring change to the Republican Party. Once the Republican Party begins to lose power at federal, state, and local levels, the Republican Party will return to its historical roots as a party for the least of these, if it is wise. Frederick Douglass stated the following words, and I quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." End of quote. Frederick Douglass was exactly right. Now, the demand will consist of the people voting against all Republican candidates, which will begin the process of removing federal, state, and local power from Republicans and giving the power to those who work for the least of these. After this goes on for a period of time and the Republican Party sees that they are losing power throughout the United States as a result of poor and middle class people voting against them in favor of candidates who work for the least of these, they will eventually concede to the demand and return to their Republican Party roots of being a party for the least of these if they are wise. In my opinion, if Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln were living today, they would not be Republicans. And as a result, they would not be voting for Republican candidates. Also, today's Republican Party has white supremacists as supporters, as proven in today's pro-Trump faction of the Republican Party, along with United States Republican Party history. A white supremacist segment of United States society has been ingrained in the Republican Party for generations. The white Southern segregationist, Senator Strom Thurmond, who ran for president in 1948, filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 1957, left the Democratic Party, and became a Republican in 1964, and afterwards, as a Republican, Thurmond voted against the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Strom Thurmond had supporters who followed him into the Republican Party, as well as there were people all throughout the South with the segregationist mindset who became Republicans when the Democratic Party endorsed civil rights for black people. This is the reason why the Republican Party is as big as it is in the South and has as much power as it does in the South. And if the Republican Party does not change back to the Republican Party of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party risks following in the footsteps of the Whig political party, which no longer exists. For those who may not know, prior to the start of the Republican Party by abolitionists, There was a political party called the Whig Party, which contained pro-slavery white supremacists and abolitionists. The Democratic Party was the other major political party, and it was a pro-slavery white supremacist political party. But today's Democratic Party completely changed from its historical roots generations ago. And today's Democratic Party supports civil rights for black people and voting rights for black people. And today's Democratic Party supports helping poor and middle-class people through laws designed to address economic inequities that exist. Now, continuing on with some Whig Party history, there was a split in the Whig Party between the abolitionists and pro-slavery white supremacists concerning slavery. And as a result, the abolitionists left the Whig Party and started a brand new political party, which they named the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln was selected as the Republican Party's first candidate for President of the United States. The popularity of the Republican Party grew as it replaced the Whig Party as the other major political party in the United States. The Whig Party eventually disappeared from existence, leaving the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as the two major political parties in the United States. Today's Republican Party is in the same shape the Whig Party was in back then before its collapse. And the question is, will the Republican Party have the same ending as the Whig Party? Only time will tell, but this opens the door for a Republican who wants the Republican Party to return to its historical roots as a party that Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln would support, to start a brand new political party. And it's going to take someone with the courage, boldness, and access to funding in today's political system to start a new political party from scratch. But it can be done. People have left the Republican Party, and there are undoubtedly well-known Republicans out there who can start a new political party and may take up the cause of starting a new political party to replace the Republican Party. If there was ever a time in United States history where the opportunity exists to start a new political party to replace the Republican Party, the time is now. Because the Republican Party of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln does not exist today. The Republican Party of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln was a party for the least of these. And today's Republican Party has a long way to go to reach its historical roots as a party for the least of these. And concerning the Democratic Party, for the people who are wondering if there are any Democrats who need to be voted out of office, there are Democrats in Congress who don't support poor and middle class legislation that they should support. And it's probably because of the districts they represent, where people are more conservative. But it's time for congressional representatives to do what is in the best interest of the poor and middle class people in their districts. And if conservative district congressional representatives would give a thorough explanation to their constituents on how social welfare programs for the poor and middle class, such as universal basic income, would not cause inflation and would directly benefit their constituents, they would see that the majority of their constituents would agree with them in their support of social welfare programs, such as universal basic income. They have to do their due diligence on the social welfare program they support. And they have to convey the information to their constituents in a thorough, easy-to-understand format. Congressional representatives have to be able to rebut any constituent with irrefutable facts that will persuade other constituents in the meeting to support them as they push for passage of the social welfare program. It's about persuading the constituents to support a social welfare program that will directly benefit the constituents while not adding to inflation. There will undoubtedly be Republicans and Democrats in the meeting, and thorough explanations will be needed to convince the constituents. And if it is explained thoroughly with irrefutable rebuttals to constituents as necessary, there are undoubtedly conservatives who will support them as they push for passage of the social welfare program. And I'm talking about conservative Democrats and conservative Republicans, because money issues are a real thing in the lives of Democrats, Republicans, and independents throughout the United States. As I stated earlier, it begins with the congressional representative giving a thorough explanation of the benefits of the social welfare program. This is what they should do when they meet with constituents. Now, concerning voting congressional representatives out of office who won't support social welfare programs they should support, they do need to be voted out of office and replaced with people who have a least of these mindset concerning poor and middle class people in the United States, and who will support social welfare program legislation that will benefit the poor and middle class constituents in their districts without adding to inflation. So new representatives should be running for congressional office to replace the congressional representatives who are applying brakes to the poor and middle class progress that can be made through social welfare program legislation that will benefit the poor and middle class. And the congressional representatives who apply brakes to the poor and middle class progress that can be made do it because of the districts they represent and/or because they're afraid to lose their seats in Congress. Although some may say they're not afraid of losing their seats in Congress. And the only way to change this is to elect new congressional representatives to replace them. If the United States keeps doing the same thing, it's going to keep getting the same results. We thank you for your time.